Thank you everyone for joining us at Visionary Days Lugano today on this conversation with Aleksander Popovic on the transformation on the air travel experience 2000 to 2025. Alex Popovic is a Senior Vice President and on the Customer Financial and Digital Services, IATA, the international organization, International Air Transport Association that everybody knows because we have taken at least an airplane in our life, representing some 290 airlines or 82% of the total air industry. Thank you very much, Mr. Popovic, to joining us.
My pleasure.
So, Mr. Popovic, you are the Senior Vice President of Customer Financial and Digital Services at IATA. Could you tell us, just give us an overview what this role entails with the airline industry?
Thank you very much, Luca. You've already briefly explained the role of IATA. The mission of IATA is to represent, lead, and serve the commercial airline industry. My role as part of IATA is the Customer Financial and Digital Services, and I just want to highlight two areas. Many of us will have bought tickets through a travel agent. If so, your money has probably gone through the IATA financial settlement system, and that connects worldwide, maybe over 50,000 travel agents, 400 airlines, and the job of that system is to get this funding on time and safely to the airline from whom you bought the ticket. So that's one area of my job. The other area is, which I think is hopefully relevant to today, is digital transformation for the airline industry. What IATA brings to the airline industry is a combination of advocacy, standards, process change, services where appropriate, to help transform the customer journey. And an example probably we're all familiar with is the ability for self-service in the customer journey. For example, the barcoding boarding pass that you'll see on your iPhone. So that very briefly is my role in IATA.
Thank you very much for that. Yes, I believe that we have seen the logo on the tickets, on the paper tickets some time back.
Yeah.
So you joined the airline industry in 1993. Can you take us, as Visionary Days in the technology focus around technology and the customer experience, can you take us through the key technological milestones that you have observed since joining the first time the airline industry?
Yeah, well, I think there's many, but it's probably in the time we've got, maybe just to highlight a few examples. One is the evolution of the aircraft technology itself. I can remember early in my career, in my previous company, flying with Concorde. This was an incredible aircraft. I wouldn't say it was environmentally friendly nor sustainable in both a financial and environmentally conscious way, but this was really an example of innovation for the airline industry. Sadly, Concorde, in terms of noise, environment, in terms of speed, was good, but it was not going to be financially sustainable, as the owners of those aircrafts discovered. The transformation has moved from that picture in my career to a really much more stronger focus on aircraft technology that is more conducive to the environment. All of us have got to take responsibility for that. And I think that's been one big change for the industry is the airline industry is one of the few areas that has committed to targets in terms of playing its part in the environmental area. So I think the evolution of aircraft technology would be one area, Luca. The other area I would say would be the impact of the internet. The airline industry goes back commercially about 100 years now, but I think a number of our airlines still have systems which are built on a pre-internet world. But the impact of the internet, prior to the internet, for those of us who are older on this call, people like me, I'm not going to talk about yourself.
I am prior internet myself. And
But,
actually, just to mention, the closest I got to a Concorde is London Heathrow on the roundabout. So
yeah.
that's how close I got to a Concorde.
And if you park your car in the car park, probably the alarm would have gone off as it went over. So it clearly was not sustainable. So, but yeah, I think the internet, prior to the internet, the airline industry was a world of call centers, travel agents, which are still highly relevant today. But today it's about the airline's website. You can see the full product offering of the airline. As a consumer, you can make your choices. So I think that's been a real transformation. It's also been a transformation in transparency of what you pay for what you get. And that in turn has led for, the price of a ticket has reduced by something like 50% in 30 years because of this transparency that you will see. And that's had a big impact on the airlines. Good for the consumer, challenging for the airlines. Part of the internet, we saw the impact of the low-cost carriers. They really were disruptors, and arguably still are, for the pricing and the revenue management system of the old legacy carriers. And then the final area over this period, I think you mentioned it, Luca, is the paper ticket. Yeah, at that point, you could see the logo of IATA, but the paper ticket in May 2008, that went. And IATA was instrumental in a 4-year period in getting the adoption of e-ticket from just under 20% in 4 years to 100%. So we don't really see a paper ticket. If you do, it's a museum piece today. In the last couple of years, I think what we're focusing on now is bringing retailing to the airline industry. Retailing, we're all familiar with how retail works in other industry sectors, but ironically for the air industry, it's a relatively new phenomenon. So the airline industry is playing catch up in bringing retail principles. You can shop. It's not simply about the price of the seat. It's about prior to the flight, during the flight, after the flight, and then you can bring your choices together in terms of what you do. So that's a very quick illustration of the changes that I've seen in my career in the airline industry.
I just wanted to ask you a question. You mentioned it, internet, and the internet has been phenomenal, as you mentioned it, on the experience and as you described, but prior COVID and in the latest discussion, there was having internet as a part of the entertainment program on board of airplanes. Is this something that was is a push coming from the members of the IATA, or is something that has been natural coming to the discussion?
Well, I think it's been a push coming from the consumer and the innovation capacity of the airline. For those of us who have the privilege of being in business travel or first class, this in-flight entertainment, we've got consumers who are spending several hours in an aircraft. You've got to innovate. And I'm pleased to see that innovation has gone to a number of airlines, I would say, into the economy cabin as well. So I think it's about differentiating your product to the traveler in terms of providing innovative products. The internet, the availability of internet on aircraft, I think it's something that's come up in the last few years, and the robustness of that is increasing. But I think it's really a consumer-driven requirement. The airlines, leaving aside COVID, no doubt we'll talk about this, even prior to COVID, the margins of the airlines are very tight. So you've got to bring value to the consumer during the flight, prior to the flight, and after the flight, if you're going to be sustainable as an airline.
I will be exactly the opposite. The airline flights, and I have been in an airplane thousands of times, was my time off. So I didn't want it. I'm not one of the customer that was looking to be connected. Actually, my team used to say that they knew how long was a flight because I used to work on emails offline and then shoot dozen of emails all of a sudden. So
Yeah.
I'm
Well,
still on a hold way.
I share. Well, I actually, it's a very important point you raise because for those of us, prior to COVID, I would be traveling pretty heavily, like many of us, and this was my protected time on a long flight. No one could touch me. I could catch up. So I wasn't exactly a fan personally of having Wi-Fi and being contactable because you're in a real-time world outside the aircraft. So I would agree with you. That's a
Yeah,
personal view.
absolutely, absolutely. So we were talking about innovation. So what is the IATA role in the innovation of the travel experience? We were just mentioning about internet on board, but what are the other element of that?
Yeah, well, I think obviously we're talking a lot about technology, but real change only digital transformation is not just about technology. It's about a combination of change. For example, the business process, uh, the people who applied, the people may be skilled in the old process, for example, check-in agents, but in the world of self-service, those skills are no longer necessary. It gives rise to new skills. And then finally, and last but not least, is technology. So basically, within IATA, we see, and not just in IATA, I think a lot of digital transformation protagonists would see the change of process, people, and technology going hand in hand to deliver a true digital transformation. To answer your question, what does IATA do? We focus on, because we're an industry association, it's not just about one company changing, it's about the transformation of an industry. And in order to deliver that lasting achievement, as well as my definition of digital, IATA has a three-pronged approach for any digital transformation. One is advocacy. For example, you may have your e-ticket standard, but you may have governments who say, not for me. So the penetration of that standard will be limited if a government, and indeed that was the case in rare occasions in the story of e-ticket, doesn't buy it. So the advocacy dimension of IATA's role is fundamental to success. The second area is standard. We had
Mr. Popovic, just to
yeah,
understand, because I
yeah,
am involved, as you know, on the UN system, so where
yeah.
member states are countries. So in IATA, you have this dual member state, so organization like airlines and plus member state like Switzerland, for example, or just airlines, just for the people
Well,
tuning in, just to understand.
yeah. So our members are airlines, okay, but to advocate, either IATA will go to a government to make the case, or it will do so in partnership with others or supporting another body. So, for example, the International Civil Aviation Organization is a UN body, as you probably know. So sometimes, depending on the standard, our job is to advise ICAO, because this is where governments come together and talk about it. So there are a number of channels of our activity to enable digital transformation. So the advocacy and the lobbying, to answer your question, it could be IATA going directly to that particular government on a particular issue to champion the cause of our members, or it could be in partnership with another body, or it could be supporting another body like ICAO. It all depends on the topic.
Yeah, thank you very much. So you were saying, I interrupted when you were talking about
No,
standards. So, so advocacy is more of a policy making, and then there is more the technical side of standard.
correct. So the advocacy, once you have a standard, you want to get the adoption and acceptance of the standard. And a key aspect of this is there for advocacy. But the standard, the e-ticket is an example of a standard that, frankly, we had that in the 1990s, but it was never adopted. It was only when we took a leading role as IATA to get the adoption up to 100%. So the third element is we may also introduce products and services to support the standard. It doesn't suggest that IATA in any way is the unique provider of the service. In fact, we encourage technology companies, having built the standard, to adopt the standard and give more choice to our members. So the advocacy standards and services strategy is key to our digital transformation for an industry. Within a company, it's different, but within an industry, you've got to engage with a wide range of stakeholders in the value chain and with governments and regulatory bodies.
So actually with IATA, you have this dual role. So IATA as an organization, so your headquarters, the two headquarters that you have, one in Geneva and the one in Montreal, you have to have very much, inside you need to be innovative in a certain sense, because when you go and talking to the airlines, you need to be up to the speed of innovation. So there is this dual direction, and of course, a number of the leading roles or member of the IATA are former or have been for a long period of time in the airline. So this knowledge sharing is very, very key to the activity.
Yeah. The other thing briefly I'd add, Luca, is we have 290 members, as you quite rightly mentioned, but the reality is those members will go at different speeds in the change process. So one thing we've learned in IATA is the concept of leaders and followers. You know, to deliver any change, you identify a small number of leading players, in our case, airlines, who will go first, work with IATA on the standard. And IATA's job is to connect the rest of the community, let's call them the followers, because sometimes going first has its risks.
Yeah, trial and error and acceptance, yeah, and so on, of course.
But I think this leader-follower strategy is very important, because you prove the standard, the benefits of the standard with the leader, and then IATA's job is to share it with its wider members to say, here are use cases of this example being done. And this is a good thing for going further together, rather than a consensus approach where all 290 airlines or 290 members have got to go at the same pace. That doesn't deliver the change required.
The question that comes to, hold on, we have somebody with the microphone on. Let me look. Sorry about that. Are you? So what I was asking you is that the leader and follower. So as a person from outside, looking at the airline industry, is the leader always the larger companies, or there is as well the surprises of smaller companies being, or smaller airlines company or regional local airlines bringing innovation on that?
It's a very good point. Short answer is we have a mix, because there are, when we say airline, there are different business models. As you quite rightly put it, there could be a regional carrier that doesn't transfer. It's a very straightforward business going from point A to point B. Yeah, but in order to adopt a standard worldwide, it's got to be relevant to the whole range of carriers, being a global network airline, a regional point-to-point airline. So when we choose our leaders, we have a good mix. For example, today in our bringing air retail, we call it the new distribution capability to the industry. We have something like 20 leading airlines, and they typically represent the whole range of business models within the 290. It's very important, because you won't scale it up. It'll be for the favored few rather than the many.
Yeah, thank you very much on that. So as we're talking about changing and leader and follower, and what are the technology challenging that faced by the airline industry as a whole, and where this will come as a leader position?
Yeah, so I think there's two areas I'd like to highlight, Luca. One is the environment. I talked a bit about the environment, but there's major challenge going forward on the environment coming out of COVID. I think the environmental issue will be even stronger. The other challenge will be in the world of distributing products and services that the airliners invested in through all channels, not only the airline website, but through the travel agent channel. I think these are two of the challenges going forward. I think the environmental challenge, I touched on the story of aircraft technology, but I think that, you know, we're one of the few industries that set a goal. In our case, by 2050, we're committed to a target, as you probably know, of halving our emissions versus 2005. That transformation is going to force us to say, today's technology is not up to it. Fuel. It will force the issue of sustainable aviation fuel. The penetration of that sustainable aviation fuel is very low today. To have any chance of getting close to that number, you've got to step up. It will force us looking at, as we are, on electronic aircraft. We've got the e-car, the hybrid car. What about the sky? You know, opinion is divided on this, but sooner or later, we've got to get into this kind of area, hydrogen aircraft, hybrid aircraft. So having, one of the important things about transformation is if you have a very clearly stated ambition, it forces you to transform. If you have an incremental vision, you stay quite comfortable with existing technology. So the environment is an example where halving our emissions by 2050 is giving us a kind of a call to action to improve technology. So that's the environment. I would also say the environment, there's a lot of talk about CO2, but it's more than that. It's about noise. It's about the use of different materials. It's about the perception of the consumer. It's about archaic air traffic control systems, for example, in Europe. You know, we're the European Union, but you wouldn't think so with our air traffic control system. You have a number of traffic lights as an airline to go. All that leads to waste, and waste is bad for the environment. So environment is one area I would highlight, Luke. And then briefly, the other big challenge is bringing retail to the airline industry. As I mentioned earlier, we built pre-internet intermediaries because of the lack of the internet, and the presence of the internet makes those intermediaries obsolete. So I think that's going to be a challenge for everybody, the airline, the technology company, the travel agent, who will think about their future in this world. What value do they add? I believe they will add value, but it will be different as an advisor to the consumer as to the offerings. So those are two areas.
Yeah, definitely. When we talk about environment and so they're working for a UN organization, the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN push forward, there are 17, and of course each one can be brought in a certain form and shape within any organization, private sector, public sector, or international organization as yourself. Just I wanted to touch upon very quickly, but then we go back maybe to later on. But there has been a change before on the thinking about innovation before and after now. This what they, I don't like it to call it pre-COVID and post-COVID. It sounds a little bit, but this is the fact. There is before March 15 and after March 15, at least in my life. Has this changed the thinking about IATA, as I know has pushed the limit of working from home and everything else, but as well the thinking process? I'm not talking about airlines, but about goals that you were setting.
The short answer is yes. I think, like with any shock, COVID, 9/11, it makes you wonder. And I just want to give you a few examples with the COVID, before and after, as you put it, Luca. Before, we would look at historic data and we would predict the future. And that's not just for airlines. You know, we would say, in the old world, we would say in the airline industry, how do you plan which aircraft to put on which route or which origin and destination? Answer, you would look at history. The history is useless in a world of COVID. It tells you nothing about the future. So this is a big shock, because a lot of our projections, our members' projections, is based on historical data where they extrapolate to the future. No disrespect to the forecasters on this call, but crudely speaking, that's what.
We were talking yesterday with somebody that is in charge of foresight for Arma Suisse, Quentin Ladetto, and he's actually said the same. He said before we were looking at some data. Right now there is no data. We are blind and from the historical data. So I think everybody would tend to agree on that one.
Yeah, but I think the good thing is it brings innovation to say, if history is no good, in this case data, what do I do? Okay, so what we're learning, and I would say we're at the beginning of the learning curve on this within IATA, is realizing we've got to bring new data sets to bear. Customer sentiment, for example, the COVID patterns, quarantines, opening and closing, real-time information, the ability to synthesize diverse data sets in real time, and then saying, there's a pattern here going on. This, to me, is the future. So I think that will be one, moving from useless historical data to synthesizing new forms of data. And IATA's job in this particular example as an airline-owned body is to make it easier to bring those data sets together and let our members choose how they do that. I think the other thing, I think the airline industry knew it, but I think it's become more vivid, and it's very basic, is consumer confidence is central. And let's be honest, at the moment, consumer confidence has taken a big knock. This is why we're all now sitting on this call, looking at each other's
or
pictures.
Either because we can't or we are not authorized to travel, yes.
Yeah, so I think the other learning point will be the importance of consumer confidence. I think in business travel, it will not come back to anything like it was in 2019. And this is the financial sustainability of the airlines. If you speak to the corporate organizations, they would talk about 2024, 2025. Why? Because they can exploit technology like we're doing today.
Yes.
They realize the potential. It does not substitute the relationship, particularly in a number of cultures around the world. This will never replace, but I think it's augmentation. I think is here. It is here to stay as a way forward. So that is another big change. And I think two other areas very briefly I'd highlight would be the first two words of IATA's vision are working together. And we've realized we will fail unless the value chain I mean the consumer, the corporate, the travel management company, the airline, the technology company, the airport. One thing about a crisis like COVID is we hurt all the same. So the unity of purpose to solve it together. In the past, it's been a good thing to do. Today, it's a must. So I would contrast pre-COVID and after. We cannot restart the industry unless those value chain members come together. It will not. And I would add the governments for the reasons we mentioned earlier. Lockdowns are effectively a travel ban. So without the governments seeing the value of travel and trade, it won't come back. So there are definitely a shift before and after.
I think you mentioned it, and yesterday night I had a conversation with the former assistant director of the FBI, Joseph Billy Jr., and we talk about 9/11 and being in the security side. 9/11 had a major change on how the travel experience was. Longer queue at the airport, larger security in some cases, and I'm sure you have that experience. Strange customer experiences where in one airport you were verified at high level, everything was ringing, and then the next airport nothing was ringing with the same watch, for example, and things like that. I remember having conversation about that. So but one element that comes to mind is that there was a disruption to the airline industry as well, I believe. I'm not the expert, but we have seen changes on the number of airlines smaller airlines were absorbed, merge and acquisition. Could we, and please don't share any top secret, but could we see this in the next few years of larger organization changing? Or I am in Switzerland, so I observe with great attention the relation between Lufthansa and Swissair. I will ask you later to help us in Lugano to have the airport back again, but that's another story. But is that something that we will have or not?
Yeah, I think the short answer is I hope for the airline sustainability we'll see more consolidation. I can't be specific about the examples you gave, but I think the airline industry is very fragmented. Even 9/11, there are similarities and differences with COVID. You know, the loss of lives in 9/11 versus COVID. Yeah, but following 9/11, we saw airline casualties. But after 9/11, the industry came back. 6 months, 12 months later, it took a knock, but it came back. Yeah, COVID is different. It will not come. We will not come back to normal where we were, if you will, in 12 months. This is a long-term shock to the industry, and pre-COVID activities will never come back. So, we're talking about a long hit. The airlines will be impacted severely. One of the benefits of airlines is the connectivity that you and me as travelers have. We go on one airline, we connect to another, and we're able to get to our destination faster. Yeah, but that connectivity is going to suffer because today, globally speaking, on average, or the median is airlines have got, on average, just over 6 months worth of cash. They've been helped by injection of government support, but that cannot go on forever. We hope the governments will give us more for our members.
Yes.
But I foresee, unfortunately, I'm sorry to say, there will be more airline casualties, much more than we saw after 9/11, because on their own they cannot survive. Together, for example, consolidation, this will be a trend. There are examples of groups. You mentioned the Lufthansa example of airlines forming groups and getting economies of scale. I mean, IAG is another example in Europe. Air France KLM is another example. Subject to government support, again, this is another factor. I think airlines will be sustainable if we see more of this consolidation opportunity coming up. But it needs governments also, the pride in the national carrier, we all understand. It needs sort of a new approach there.
If we move away now from COVID, just to focus more on the visionary, on the technology, on the customer experience that we should or we want to have in a certain sense. I'm looking forward to travel. I am a travel addicted, so I'm looking forward. So, what the key changes as a traveler, as a pleasure traveler, as a business traveler, we will experience, or we could experience in 5 years' time?
Yeah, well, the first thing I would say is it's going to take those 5 years for recovery, just to be straight. Recovery on the basics, never mind the transformation. But I would identify a number of areas. I think right now IATA's focus on helping restart the airline system. Yeah. Because we've talked about quarantines. One of our goals is to persuade the importance right now of testing as a substitute for putting a passenger in quarantine. For you and me as a traveler, it's no good to me if I can get on my flight and then when I arrive, I have the uncertainty that I have. So I think the restart of the system, advocating for consistent testing as opposed to quarantines is a basic step going forward. We hope there's going to be a vaccine, but There are different views on that. So I think right now, testing versus quarantines is the right thing to go. The other thing is getting and it's related to this, getting consumers confident in flying again. And each of us have different emotions about this thing. IATA is doing a lot to show objectively the measures being taken to make flying safe. And I don't just mean the original version of safety, it's safe for me to go forward. There's a lot of work that IATA is doing on that. But beyond that, when it comes to transformation, as we touched on earlier, because of the shift in demand, the nature of demand, I think the other area we're going to see is the need for contactless travel. You know, right now, when I touch something, there's a risk to me in some shape or form. So we're using this as an opportunity for innovation to say, I have my iPhone, whatever my Android is, and I literally don't have to touch anything. I just swipe and I walk to the aircraft. This is called contactless travel. Fortunately, prior to COVID, IATA has done a lot of work on biometrics. There are a number of options that, as I'm sure you know, we can look at. The ability for me to have my application, I can choose my identification if I want it to be my passport or whatever. It's up to me, and it's confidential to me, and I will only consent to sharing it to the parties I wish to do so. So contactless travel, from an IATA standpoint, we see as a very good thing to do for COVID, but beyond COVID. It's an example of an innovation that has been triggered by a COVID event and a hit, but also we see it's good for the traveler going forward. Now, to pull that off, I mentioned advocacy standards and services. I think we're in good shape on standards. We have, for example, an IATA application on contact. You know, there will be other companies doing these applications. The more choice, the better. The advocacy dimension of contactless travel, getting governments to accept it, because we understand the national security measures being taken, but you know, travelers are international. So the contactless travel I see as a very exciting area going forward for the traveler.
I think you were mentioning one element, and we know that actually the Director General of the World Health Organization mentioned it. There was this info pandemic where information were far above of any kind of information we have seen before. Or and when I talk about information, I go from good, bad, and ugly. So really, anything is out there. We know that that we spoke about it in other occasion and with the security word. So IATA has a role as well to confirm that if I catch a flight, the security, the safety, as you mentioned, it is okay. But, and I know it's a tricky question, but is that something that is coordinated with the member? I give you my example. I flew to Rome not long ago in one airline. I will not name it. I had certain rules, and coming from Rome with another airline, I had completely different rules. And I remember having a little bit of confusion as well at the airport. So is this customer experience, I'm talking really about this type of rules, something that we need to clarify as well to bring customer confidence back?
Short answer is yes. I think particularly, let's take, and I've been talking with corporate organizations, travel agents, airlines. Everybody agrees that, let's take COVID as an example, there should be a kind of a, let's call it the minimum standard. So whichever flight I go, I know as a minimum, I can be assured of the following things. The aircraft ventilation as this minimum standard, and it's 99.99%. So this minimum standard, there is a crying call from all parties in the value chain have this, and IATA's working hard on this. For an airline to see this as a competitive edge, I'll be honest with you, I see this as the wrong way to go, in all honesty. I think our consumers want consistency and confidence that all these minima will be. Now, obviously, if an airline does more, fantastic, but visible adherence to a minimum standard. This is a major push, which I think is very important to bring consumer confidence going forward. So we're putting a lot of energy into that, and it will be of value because, as I say, corporate organizations will value it, travel agents will value it, everybody will, and the consumer will therefore be more comfortable with it.
If we come back a little bit from an innovation perspective, how is IATA innovating in a sense of there is a push for innovation, so there is an innovation labs, or there is an innovation working group, or it's just wait and see, and then Airbus come up with something new and say, hey, by the way, this is my new toy.
Yeah, a lot of airlines have innovation labs, very successful, but one of the challenges for an individual airline lab is the capacity of that airline to take on its own innovation. It only has a finite number of resources. So one thing we've done at IATA is to call it an innovation lab. We call it an accelerator of change. We do it at an industry level. We call it Accelerate at IATA. And I'm very excited by this because what it does, it addresses this issue that I can only take on so much innovation in my company, but at an industry level, there's that critical mass to do this. So we put a lot of effort into this accelerated IATA initiative last year. It's based in Geneva, actually, Luca.
Thank you very much. We are very happy.
But what we started off last year, prior to COVID, is we focused on how do we accelerate airline retail? How do we bring more choice to our airlines in terms of new entrant companies, for example? So we made some progress on this. During COVID, I would say, we're still using accelerated IATA, but the focus is now on what are the innovations to help restart the industry. The concept is the same. We have partners, we have airlines, we bring new entrants in, and success is that airline is happy with one of those new entrants and they use their solution. So yes, it's a big theme for us.
So just maybe as we coming slowly to a closing, and we might ask the people tuning in to ask questions, but so Accelerator IATA is not just customer driven, is as well airline driven, so we can see changes on are we looking at the information and communication technology being more and more the focus of the changes, or as well changes on layout of airplanes? I flew, I'm sure you did, I didn't flew Concorde, but I flew A380. Are we seeing changes on the experience as well on board of airplanes?
Well, I think accelerated IATA tends to focus, we tend not to do technology first. We go, what is the business problem we're addressing first, okay? And then we say, what are the innovative ways of achieving that? So I think that's very important. We learned the lesson of previous innovations. In fact, 10, 15 years ago, we had a technology like RFID, and we were driven by the technology and not by the business problem. Now, the realization came several years ago, I'm very pleased to say, that we said, well, one of the key problems is baggage management. Imagine we had economies of scale worldwide, an industry solution using a standard, an RFID standard. It's there to support the issue rather than a solution looking for a problem. So the first point is we tend to look at the business problem first and so on. When it comes to aircraft, that's more in the realms of the aircraft manufacturers, in all honesty, than it is with IATA. You know, there is consumer input to those aircraft manufacturers by the airlines themselves and to some extent IATA, but that IATA would not tend to lead on, you know, the new redesign of an environmentally friendly aircraft. There are other bodies who are much more skilled in that.
Okay, thank you very much. We are coming to a close. So I would say if there is any question from the people attending, please ask the question on the chat. But the COVID has been an accelerator for everybody. You know, the accelerator of working from home, the accelerator of remote conversation like this one, having kids, remote schooling, and many other elements. So if we to say this opportunity to accelerate, actually seen it as a taking away the negative of the COVID, but this is as you mentioned it as well. We tend to say that is a shock to the system. How much acceleration can bring, or is this faster than expected, or is just there is going to be surprises?
Well, look, on this one, the shock is a negative, but the positive is the speed, the speed of innovation that it brings. You know, things that in the past we would talk about and go on about it for years. You say we don't have years, we literally have weeks or months. I saw this in 9/11, by the way. After 9/11, in that particular case, it was the advent of low-cost carriers, and the airlines, the legacy airlines, realized that if they didn't adapt, in this example, Europe, they would be beaten by those low-cost carriers. So change had to happen in weeks and months rather than years. So I think it's very important to see such a shock as a accelerator, as you put it, for innovation. Okay. Another drive for the airlines is the amount of time they have with cash to survive. I mentioned the median average of 6 months. Don't plan some change in a year because you won't be around. So I think it is a real positive stimulus for the industry to really move things forward. So the innovations which I mentioned, like contactless, other areas. How do we help our airlines look at demand in a new way? I foresee quick hits coming through rather than long 3-year projects. So the time to deliver will contract as a result of this shock.
In IT and in project management, and I'm sure you know this very well, is we talk about agile and burst of project, and then of course when you come to a more policy making, being currently in an agency where policy making is all about, agile doesn't come very much to the policy making, especially in the current geopolitical arena where there are other elements out there. So innovation from a technology perspective has to be brought on an agile, and you mentioned it as 6 months. So really business transformation itself, which then it transforms as well the client, the customer. So the large corporation sending people across the board, traveling in a secure environment and safe environment. And I think you mentioned it as well, and it's interesting because nowadays some people don't take the airplane because they say, I might go to London for business, but then if I land over there and overnight one or the other government decide that there is a lockdown, I'm stuck there, or I'm stuck when I go back. So this element of clarity on the business transformation as well, on the company as well.
Yeah, but look, even there, I agree with you very briefly. It is challenging with governments. I mean, I remember agile technology as well. But even there, I think for a transformation, you've got to break it down into, I use the example of leaders and followers, finding one government at origin, finding one government at destination, one use case, showing it works, goes faster but then it's an example of leadership of the change required in the industry. And then you demonstrate with that value chain and those consenting governments that this is doable. Okay, so sometimes we're defeated by the sheer scale of the global problem. You've got to break it down into a manageable chunk, and change comes when you've got real examples of fast progress, because then others see the wisdom of following. And this is the role of IATA, moving from a consensus approach to having those examples of delivering the change. In this particular example, we talked about a minimum standard for COVID, building consumer confidence, both governments consent, the airline consent, and the consumer is confident enough to travel. Those examples are very, very important going forward. And I believe they can be delivered quickly if you break it down in that way.
I hope those that are involved on those activity, they will understand the breaking down. I think you mentioned it. Breaking down to the minimal and manageable activity is very important.